Dark greetings all. The title refers to the 157 books on the official timeline included in most reprints nowadays, including 9 novelizations and 6 short story collections. Before I start, this is an opinion warning. This is of course not an objective list, and it is perfectly okay to disagree with me. Also, my opinion on any of these books might change in the future. Just while making this video, I've had to shift around my rankings a bit. Also, a quick note here, the reading order listed on each slide is just from the order I read them in, which is roughly by release date. You don't necessarily have to follow that order, I just thought the slides would be more interesting if I put it there. Capital F tier, these are the books that I simply disliked reading. Unfortunately, to enjoy a book, I have to be able to understand what is going on. I've never done hard drugs, but I imagine the experience I had reading Barbara Hambly's books is not far off. I simply had no idea what was going on for most of them, and they are my bottom 2. Not far ahead are the last 2 Republic Commando novels, which are both long, incredibly boring, very long, have characters act mega dumb just to service the quote-unquote plot, and are far too long than they have any right to be. The second Clone Wars Gambit book is an exercise in futility. You can just read the last 40% of this, and honestly not as much apart from some sedative in book form. Slave Ship is blessedly short, but somehow also incredibly slow, and demands a lot of what was built up in the first. Boba Fett, more like boring Fett. Speaking of boring, last summer, there was a night where I was having trouble falling asleep. After an hour of jostling in bed, I decided to read a chapter of Tatooine Ghost. I was out within 15 minutes. Boring is actually the main problem I have with a lot of the books here. Revelation takes forever to get going, Razor's Edge feels completely uninspired, and I have a dislike for Troy Denning's writing style that very much biased me against most of his works. Though the characters aren't quite as dumb, the second and third Republic Commando books are still quite dull, and the wacky aliens and sometimes comedically dumb action scene in the other Bounty Hunter Wars books just barely keep them from being lower. Maul Lockdown is too busy trying to keep you guessing to tell a decent story. Tempest is slightly better than many of Denning's works, but not redeemably so. The main character of Shadow Games is so passive that it doesn't even have an effect on the outcome of his own story, and Reunion was the third book in a trilogy that was decent but slow, and I'd run out of patience by the time I got around to it. Lowercase F tier. These are the books that I see some positives in, but still did not like. Inferno was by Troy Denning, but it's at least shorter than his other works, and has a few entertaining scenes. Sacrifice I genuinely like the first 2/3 of, but the last third is horrendous. It can only happen because all the characters act stupidly dumb. Invincible is good in the first half, but has one incredibly uncomfortable scene, and fails to wrap up its series satisfyingly. Stealth is boring, but not quite sedative level, also has decent character writing. Revan is 96% alright, and 4% the worst thing I've ever read. The ending is a slap to the face to the reader, and makes the whole book feel like it only exists to set up a game. Oh, wait. It's somewhat cool to read about the origins of the Jedi, but the characters in Dawn of the Jedi are just not that interesting, especially the villain. A story about a completely random Jedi going on a murder mystery could be fun, if it didn't get lost in about 5 different side quests along the way. For the avid fans out there, iJedi this low will probably be controversial. However, I don't find Corran to be a very compelling first-person protagonist, and the structure of the plot makes a lot of the first half of the book just seem pointless. Force Heretic fulfills its purpose in the narrative of the New Jedi Order series, but it's quite slow and lacks chapters, which makes it read weirdly. Balance Point is also slow, and the good character work wasn't quite enough to redeem it to good for me. I love the other 2 Lando Adventures books, but Starcave has scenes out of order for no good reason, and that just really got on my nerves while I was reading it. Meh tier. These books I didn't like, but due to reasons that I feel are very specific to me. I don't like horror or stuff with a lot of gore, so Red Harvest was pretty much an automatic no for me. The Force Unleashed novels are so close to the games, and the little added content is so dull that I would strongly recommend just playing or replaying the games instead of reading them. Death Troopers also has a lot of gore, but it at least has characters that are much more likable than Red Harvest. D tier. These books I would say I liked, but just barely. Splinter of the Mind's Eye is quite dull on its own, but as a historical artifact it's at least somewhat interesting. Courtship introduces a lot of cool lore, but I found it kind of boring after the first third. The New Hope novelization is also just a historical artifact, but since it's a novelization of something I was already familiar with, it read a lot better than Splinter to me. Scoundrels has a solid premise, but the story gets way too complex and tedious for me to bother to keep track of it towards the end. The Empire Strikes Back and Phantom Menace novelizations are both competently written and have a few extra scenes, but I don't really feel they do enough to elevate their movies. Both The Approaching Storm and Rogue Planet would be the absolute favorite book of someone who likes solid character work and extravagant, never-ending descriptions of the environment. Unfortunately, I am only a fan of one of these things. C tier. These books are comfortably good, but still nowhere near perfect in my eyes. Ruins of Dantooine is rough, but the main character is at least pretty cool. Riptide gets weird in a good way, but the characters are not as compelling as in the previous book of the series. You can find plenty of material on the internet about how ridiculous Crystal Star is, but I think it's at least fun and how wacky it gets. Contrary to its title, Wild Space is a very slow book that luckily has some good character writing for Obi-Wan and Bail Organa. Return of the Jedi novelization doesn't add many scenes, but Khan's prose is far better than the other original trilogy authors. Attack of the Clones novelization adds a ton of extra scenes to the movie, but not all of them are of substance. The Corellian trilogy has an entertaining story, but is super slow. It definitely could have been 2 books or even 1 instead of a trilogy, and would have been better for it. Bloodwines was decent, but didn't really have any sort of climax to its story, which made it feel odd. Wedge's Gamble is my least favorite X-Wing novel, just because I found the plot relied too much on coincidence. The Bane trilogy reads very well and has fun action, but the main characters are not very compelling and the writing lacks depth. Kenobi is a solid depiction of Obi-Wan, but he's not in it that much for the first half, and I didn't find the main original character to be very interesting. Honor Among Thieves is fun, but the first third is way better than the rest of it. Millennium Falcon has some moments of brilliance, but the main story has a very unsatisfying ending. Hard Contact was the only Republic Commando book that I actually liked. Despite a really cool new character, Patterns of Force feels really directionless until the last 100 pages. The Clone Wars novelization completely changes the tone of the movie. It takes a kids' movie and writes it as a gritty war drama. The results are mixed. Before the Storm actually has great world building and military drama, but Luke, Leia, and Han act completely out of character in it. B tier. It was at this point in writing the script that I realized that there is no way this video is going to be less than 10 minutes long. Oh well. These books are very good, but I wouldn't quite call them great. Street of Shadows is a fun murder mystery that also gets really wacky at times. Omen served its purpose for the series, but it's so short that it doesn't really develop its own narrative very well. Oh boy. Darth Plagueis is a book that a lot of people absolutely love, and the way it ties together everything going on in that era, continuity-wise, is wonderful. But personally, I found the main characters just weren't very interesting. In general, I don't usually connect with Sith when they're the star of the story, and Plagueis himself is just kind of dull personality-wise. At least to me. Additionally, I don't find the book's exploration of midichlorians to be all that satisfying. Once more, I really do like this book, just not as much as others. Allegiance is a fun, mostly self-contained tale, but its sequel does pretty much everything better. Aaron Allston is one of my favorite authors, and he unfortunately had a heart attack while writing Backlash. We were very lucky he was able to write it at all, but sadly it's the book of his that I like the least. It feels very meandering, especially in the middle section. Fatal Alliance has a very cool plot with a large cast of characters, but I didn't really connect with them as much as I would have liked. Outbound Flight is another one that people would probably have way higher, and naturally I love the space battles and Thrawn, but the inclusion of Anakin and Obi-Wan in this is completely unnecessary and it really bogs down the first half. I do know the editors pretty much forced on to include them, but it still really does hurt the story. Exile has one really great subplot, but Legacy of the Force's main character arc really took a bad turn in Book 3, and the rest of the series just wasn't able to salvage it for me. Jedi Twilight feels like a mutant child of two of Michael Reeves' better books, but is still quite solid. The Last Jedi, no, not that one, has a much more focused story than the trilogy it follows, which I really like. Dark Lord is a really good book and has some great moments, but I don't think Lucina wrote the main characters particularly well. The Jedi Academy trilogy is very much a mixed bag, but it is at least consistently entertaining. There are not many books here that would be mainly classified as a mystery story, but Survivor's Quest is, and it's pretty good at that too. I find Karen Traviss to be a very inconsistent author, but No Prisoners is definitely my favorite of her Star Wars books. Shadows of the Empire does a great job of connecting The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, but the main new villain was just not that interesting, and there's one very uncomfortable scene in this which you will definitely know about if you've read it. Ascension does a good job of setting up the last book of the series, even if that last book didn't deliver very well. Karpyshyn can write good plots and action, but Annihilation rises above his other works because the main character is actually somewhat interesting to read about. Of all the books in this video, Jedi Trial is the first I ever read. The characters are all pretty meh and sometimes quite cringy, but the action is really entertaining and the book definitely focuses on that. It was written by Vietnam War veterans and it definitely shows. Star by Star is the best Troy Denning Star Wars book. Dark Journey is like an epilogue to Star by Star, but due to how it handled the characters, I wound up preferring it to Star by Star, just slightly. The Black Fleet Crisis is a series of quotable lines and eloquent prose, and once a trilogy is written, it tempts and tantalizes and transfixes until someone finds a reason to read it. The Cestus Deception is actually pretty similar in style to the Black Fleet Crisis, but it's only one book instead of 3, so it avoids feeling bloated. Knight Errant has one of the coolest settings within the Star Wars universe. Everything else about the book is average at best, but exploring the various factions in the sector that the book takes place in is incredibly interesting. Outcast is a very solid setup for a series that ultimately failed to deliver on that promise. Crosscurrent has a great story, but there were a bunch of little things about the writing that bothered me. Aaron Allston's passing in 2014 was a tragedy, but at least his last Star Wars book was a good one. The Five Tales books collect a bunch of short stories of varying degrees of quality, but on average, they're quite good. A tier. Now we enter the territory of greatness. I love each and every book from here on out. If not for some weird additions to the events of A New Hope, Death Star would probably be in my top 30. Also, about 30 books ago, I talked about Backlash was a step down for Allston. Fortunately, he got back in his groove for Conviction, and it's really entertaining, especially in the last quarter. If there's one thing the early New Jedi Order books needed to do, it was establish the Vong as a serious threat. Ruin lives up to its title very well. Choices of One is probably the best executed plot of any standalone book on this list. It says a lot about the X-Wing series that Izar's Revenge is one of the weaker books in it, yet is still this high. Hero's Trial was James Lucino's first Star Wars novel, and he had no trouble getting into it. What I remember most fondly about Deceived is how some of the main characters actually have a proper definitive end to their stories that isn't just them dying. That is really rare in Star Wars literature, and I very much appreciate it. The MedStar books blur together a lot in my memory, but they both got some great character work and surprisingly profound moments. Shatterpoint is literally Apocalypse Now with Jedi, written by one of the most eloquent authors to touch the franchise. Need I say more? Many will find me having the Revenge of the Sith novelization here to be too low, though it starts out fantastic. I find the prose becomes a lot less special later in the book, outside of a few specific passages. However, this is still undoubtedly my favorite of the novelizations. Shadows of Mindor is just a lot of fun to read, from the inside jokes to the complete wackiness of the battle that unfolds in it, and the cover is simply awesome. Final Prophecy is excellent setup for the end of the series, and the only thing that stopped me from enjoying it more is that I thought it was going to be more self-contained. If I reread it keeping in mind that it's really just a prologue for the Unifying Force, it might be in my top 20. Cloak of Deception has fantastic political intrigue, but is lacking in the character department. The truly remarkable thing about it is that it explains the Phantom Menace movie better than the novelization does. Allies is the best of its series. I just love the amount of manipulation that all of the characters try to do to one another. You might remember way back in number 122, I had the third Lando Adventures book. Fortunately, the first two are told like a normal story, and the wackiness found within is a lot of fun to read about. Similarly, the Han Solo adventures are a blast to read, but feel much more grounded in the Star Wars universe. And funnily enough, the third book reads like an Indiana Jones movie in space, yet Raiders of the Lost Ark hadn't even been released when it came out. Michael Reeves is a very solid author, and Shadowhunter is my favorite of his works. It's basically the first Terminator movie, but with Maul instead of the T-800, and it's actually even better than that premise sounds. The New Rebellion and Truce at Bakura are pretty similar in my mind. They're both one-off stories from the 90s that write all the characters really well and have an interesting one-off threat. They even both have a lovable side character who then never appears again. Fury is the only book in the second half of The Legacy of the Force that I enjoy, but I love it. It shifts the series from trying to make the unsympathetic bad guy sympathetic to just making him cartoonishly evil, which makes him really fun to hate, even though it's kind of unfortunate that the series had to go that way, but it's also got some awesome action. The Stackpole X-Wing books were the first time we had novels that didn't star Luke, Han, and Leia, and they're great. If Top Gun and Star Wars sounds interesting to you, do not hesitate to pick these up. Legacy of the Force is a series that sadly peaked on the first book for me, but I at least really did love Betrayal. Though Ruin is by any measure more catastrophic, I really dig how messed up Onslaught's ending is, and the story leading up to it felt a lot tighter as well. As I write this script, I'm struggling to remember exactly why I enjoyed Rebirth outside of the climactic story moment, but Keyes is a great author who manages to cover a lot of ground and have a lot of subplots in less than 300 pages, which is very impressive. A+ tier. We're entering an area where the gaps in quality between entries are very small. I adore all these books and see very few flaws in them. The Lost Tribe of the Sith collected stories are my favorite story about the Sith. John Jackson Miller manages to write really interesting characters despite them being all, evil, and the plot is really unique for Star Wars in a good way. The Hand of Thrawn duology is a very satisfying conclusion to one of the busiest areas of the Star Wars timeline. Rebel Stan's main threat is inconsequential to the larger story of the New Jedi Order, but oh man, Austin writes it very well. Jedi Eclipse is a really thrilling espionage-type story with a lot of different factions at play, and I really love how Lucino managed to balance everything in it. You may think Kevin J. Anderson's fourth Star Wars novel is called Darksaber, but to me, it is simply dark-based. I actually found some sections of the Unifying Force to be a bit dull, but it does such a magnificent job of concluding the New Jedi Order series that its flaws are easily forgotten. Destiny's Way is a book that simply does everything well. Walter John Williams deserved to write more for Star Wars. As good as Stackpole's X-Wing books are, Aaron Alston's are the true highlight of the series. They do pretty much everything better, especially when it comes to humor. Dark Rendezvous probably has the best depiction of Yoda in any Star Wars story, and it also handles Dooku, Ventress, and its new characters extremely well. Much like Destiny's Way, the author earned the right to write more Star Wars books, but alas, he never did. S tier. These are the 10 out of 10s. The only difference between A+ and S is just my incredibly subjective enjoyment of them while reading. Vector Prime had the mission of introducing the main threat of the 19-book New Jedi Order series, and it did that extremely well. Somewhat similarly, Conquest is where the series started to make the enemy of the series feel more quote-unquote human, and it did that wonderfully. Starfighters of Adamar is an incredible balance of humor, character, plot, and especially romance. There's really nothing it does wrong. Traitor is a very unique book. There are about 5 named characters in the whole story, and a large chunk of the plot can be described as just 2 people talking. Yet it discusses some very profound philosophical questions, and is possibly the most beautifully written book on this list. 10 out of 10. Reading it gave me an existential crisis. Rebel Dream has the single best opening line of any Star Wars book, and it is just epic from start to end. If you're watching this video, it is a near certainty that you have already heard or read a lot about the Thrawn trilogy. I'll just keep this brief and say that this series does the absolute best job of capturing the feeling of the original trilogy movies. I'm not someone who considers himself a particularly big fan of Han Solo as a character, but the Han Solo trilogy does an amazing job of putting together a backstory for him while also having some of the most memorable original characters in all of Star Wars literature and paying respects to the material that came before it. It is an absolute shame that A.C. Crispin will never write more for Star Wars. Labyrinth of Evil is an excellent prelude to Revenge of the Sith, but it goes above and beyond. It also provides a lot of great reveals about events throughout the prequel trilogy, while balancing a huge number of characters in an all-caps epic story, all written by one of the greatest authors to ever write for the franchise. I was actually at a loss to describe how much I enjoyed this book while writing the script. It is simply amazing, and my #1 favorite Legends novel. Thank you for watching.